Life of the Forest, Orchids. Orchids. Who does not know them or has not come across them at least once? Probably each of us has or has had on the windowsill of our flat or house a popular, especially in recent years, orchid. This is usually a specimen from the botanical genus Phalaenopsis, commonly known as a moth orchid, or from the genus Cattleya or Dendrobium. We are offered thousands of hybrids or varieties of orchid species with extremely showy, long-lasting flowers. The market for ornamental orchids is worth millions of dollars a year and continues to grow. Not everyone knows that the popular vanilla used in cooking is also a species of liana orchid from Central and South America. Namely the flat-leaved vanilla, the fruit of which, pod-like sacs, are widely used in households as a spice aroma. In Turkey and the Balkans, on the other hand, a drink was traditionally made from the powdered tubers of the early purple orchid called salep, which was consumed with various additives, especially in winter. It has a warming effect and was once believed to have aphrodisiac properties. There are, of course, many more uses for plants from the orchid family. Orchidaceae, commonly called the orchid family, is one of the most numerous families on Earth. It includes more than 25,000 documented species, and it is estimated that there may be up to 40,000 species. The vast majority of species live in intertropical zones, mainly tropical Asia and South America. Most are found in tropical montane cloud forests. The further away from the tropics, the number of species decreases rapidly. Orchidaceae, as these plants should properly be called, are cosmopolitan. They are found on all continents except Antarctica. The word orchid literally means one of the 880 genera of the orchid family, namely the genus Orchis. For most of us inhabitants of the moderate zone, orchids are associated almost exclusively with cultivated, colorful varieties or hybrids, and above all with exotic tropical plants from faraway lands. However, not everyone knows that in our Polish forests, on our Polish meadows and in our country, we also have representatives of the orchid family. That is, around 50 species, including hybrids. In the majority of cases, these are not as magnificent and impressive plants as in tropical countries. As far as our domestic orchid species are concerned, we also have species with magnificent, spectacular, quite large flowers, such as the lady's slipper orchid, which is probably the most beautiful of our Polish orchids. But there are also other botanical genera, such as the marsh orchid or the genus Platanthera. Most species, due to the fact that they live in tropical and subtropical zones, live directly on the trunks, branches and leaves of trees and shrubs without producing roots typical of other vascular plants. They belong to a life form called epiphytes. They have numerous aerial roots covered with a silvery fuzz called velamen, which has the task of capturing and temporarily storing water contained in the air. Some of the roots contain chlorophyll, a green pigment, and can aid photosynthesis. It is important to remember that in evergreen rainforests, it is very dark under the canopy of trees. Aerial roots are accompanied by adventitious roots, which attach the plant to the ground. All our orchid species are terrestrial species. They produce specially modified roots and enter into mycorrhizal associations with fungi, which is sometimes an obligatory association for the survival of certain species, such as the non-photosynthetic ones that do not produce chlorophyll. All of our native orchids are terrestrial species, and their roots usually form storage organs such as tubers of various shapes. The storage organ here is a specially modified underground shoot in the form of a rhizome. Leaves of orchids have a rather simple structure. Most often they are undivided, oblong or egg-shaped with parallel veins and spathouse at base. In some species, they are perennial and long-lasting, such as the only evergreen orchid found in the coniferous forests of Poland, the creeping lady's tresses. This species is still relatively uncommon in the north and northeast of Poland, while in other parts of our country it is one of the rarest elements of the flora. What is interesting, this plant is most closely related to the autumn lady's tresses. It is a very similar plant in terms of flowers, but it inhabits completely different habitats. It can be found in extensively grazed grasslands, mainly in the mountains. The creeping lady's tresses gets its Polish name from the fact that its flowers on the inflorescence usually point to one side, as you can clearly see here. However, there are also some species that produce virtually no leaves. The leaves then take the form of scales on the shoot, lacking chlorophyll, as it happens in the case of our ghost orchids or bird's nest orchids. It is worth saying here that these species do not carry out photosynthesis at all, and we call them non-photosynthetic orchids. Orchids can range in size from a few millimeters to several meter-high creepers such as vanilla. One of the most characteristic features of orchids is the structure of flowers and their elements. Flowers or inflorescences have many different shapes, colors, forms, and sizes. However, flowers with dorsiventral symmetry predominate. The flower structure is the result of the adaptation of most species to pollination by insects, less frequently by higher vertebrate organisms such as hummingbirds in Central and South America. Examples of adaptations for pollination include the special structure of the flower. Such an expression here is the developed labellum, which can have various patterns invisible to the human eye, which are a kind of landing strip for various insects, mostly Hymenoptera. The flowers are usually hermaphroditic, but in some orchids self-pollination is possible and even the phenomenon of cleistogamy occurs. The ability to pollinate with their own pollen before the flowers open. Our native ghost orchids can, for example, not open their flowers at all and bloom underground. The flowers of orchids are not differentiated into a calyx and a corolla as in other flowering plants, but have perianth leaves like the protruding reddish-brown ones of our native lady's slipper orchid. One of them forms a so-called labellum, which sometimes has spectacular coloration and shape. In the lady's slipper, it resembles an elongated yellow balloon with a narrow entrance to its interior. The surface of the labellum often shows characteristic patterns which are a distinguishing mark for pollinating insects. Usually there is a so-called gynostemium, formed by the fusion of the stamens with the pistil style and its stigmas. It is usually hidden inside the flower and not very visible, which in many Orchidaceae meant that they had to develop specific ways to be pollinated by insects. The flowers of the lady's slipper are trap-like. The edges of the labellum are heavily waxed and curled, making it easy for insects that sit on them to fall inside. To leave the trap, the insect must follow a special trail. These are rows of small hairs and red spots located along the veins inside the labellum. When climbing, the insect first encounters a large stigma, which it rubs against. In this way, it leaves on it the pollinium from other specimens it has previously visited. As it climbs higher, it rubs against the waxy pollen mass, collecting new genetic material with which it can pollinate the next representative of the same species. This sequence of how the insects leave the trap set by the lady's slipper orchid protects it from self-pollination. Slightly different adaptations have been developed by species of the genus Ophrys. Their labellum, in terms of shape and often also color and smell, resembles the abdomen of the female in certain insect species. During the copulation attempt, pollination of the Ophrys occurs. The insect usually hits its head on the pollinium and stigma. In the Polish flora, until recently, only one species of Ophrys was known, the fly orchid. In recent years, however, several localities of the second representatives of this genus have been discovered in our country, the bee orchid. It is the latest to bloom and at the same time produces the largest flowers of all European Ophrys. In most orchids, there is a phenomenon of resupination, that is, a twisting of the ovary or the short peduncle, usually by 180 degrees. As a result, the labellum occupies a position in the lower part of the flower under the gynostemium, making it an ideal landing site for pollinators. These are mostly hymenopterous flies, ants, crickets, butterflies and beetles, and sometimes even birds, bats or frogs. This is an evolutionary adaptation of Orchidaceae to pollination by different animals. Another is the ability of insects to carry not individual pollen grains, but a whole mass of them, which is glued together to form a pollinium. This in turn easily sticks to the insect by means of a sticky pedicel. The fruit of orchids are usually elongated sacs which, when dry, burst open and release microscopic seeds from within, some of the smallest in the world. They sometimes reach a mass of several millionths of a gram, For this reason, this entire systematic group used to be called microspermae, or small-seeded plants. Plants produce seeds in huge numbers, some species even several 100,000, in which they are similar to fungi and their spores. The seeds are devoid of any nutrients and contain only the beginnings of plant embryos consisting of a few or a dozen or so cells. Most orchid species develop in symbiosis with fungi, forming mycorrhizae. Seeds have a very short lifespan, from a few to several dozen hours, so if they do not find a suitable fungal partner in this time, they die. If they succeed in doing so, however, the fungal hyphae penetrate the seed cells. There are also species which are already entwined with mycorrhizal fungal hyphae during flowering. The seed falling to the surface already has a fungal partner in it. Usually after 2 to 5 years, but sometimes even after 10 years, the first green leaves of the juvenile stage begin to appear, and in the following years they are already replaced by definite leaves, typical leaves which are capable of assimilation, and usually at this point the plant becomes independent of the mycorrhizal fungus. However, there are some species in our orchid flora that remain in a mycorrhizal association with the fungus all their lives, such as the bird's nest orchid, the ghost orchid, and the early coral root. Life and development of orchids without the right fungi would be impossible. We are in the Rospuda Valley, in the western part of the Augustów Forest. Admittedly, it is relatively early, but we were greeted here by flocks of botflies. We are in this place because we wanted to see the population of several species of the orchid family which occur here, and one of them is the marsh helleborine, Epipactis palustris. It is still a relatively common representative of the orchid family in northeastern Poland. While in the Rospuda Valley Basin, on the mosslands above the Rospuda Valley, it is one of the most numerous national populations, certainly comprising many thousands of specimens. Polish orchids can be found in a variety of habitats, from various types of peat bogs through wet and fresh meadows, dry grasslands, various types of forest ecosystems where there is a whole range of species depending on the plant community, to foothills and mountain pastures. The common spotted orchid grows in shady, fertile and moist forests, along waterbanks in wet areas. This species has beautiful large inflorescences with variable flower colors. It often forms hybrids with other orchid species. It is one of the few native orchids to have nectar-producing flowers. Its leaves are decorated with numerous dark spots. Some orchid species are attached to a single habitat type. Others have a wide ecological amplitude and can inhabit diverse ecosystems. All orchids are under species protection in Poland. Most of them are vanishing, receding and rare plants. That is why they are included in the Polish Red Book of Plants and the Polish Red List of Ferns and Flowering Plants. Two orchid species, the lady slipper orchid and the fen orchid, are included in Annex II of the EU Habitats Directive, whose protection requires designation of special areas of conservation. The Rospuda Valley is a refuge for over 20, that is more than half of the Polish representatives of the Orchidaceae family, commonly called orchids found in our country. Fen orchid, called Liparis loselli in Latin, is a very small orchid which is associated exclusively with peat bogs, mainly low alkaline bogs, and less frequently with transitional bogs in very well-watered areas. Unfortunately, due to the fact that we are strongly transforming the environment in which we live, more than half of the national sites of this very rare species have disappeared in the last 100 years. The situation is little better, or rather worse, in most neighboring countries, both east, south and west of our borders. Nevertheless, here in the Rospuda Valley, there is one of the 2 or 3 most numerous national populations of the species. Like most of the Orchidaceae, such as a fen orchid, its populations are characterized by very large fluctuations in numbers every year. This is normal in this family. However, on the basis of many years of research, it is estimated that this population numbers at least 5, in some years even over 20,000 specimens. This species is very small in size, but nevertheless produces small but very interestingly shaped flowers during the flowering period. However, some orchid species, due to their development and environmental conditions, may only appear in the form of inflorescent shoots once every few years, such as the ghost orchid, the bird's nest orchid, the early coral root, and hence there is often a misconception that the species is extinct in a given area. The broad-leaved marsh orchid is a species which until recently was one of the most common orchids in our country. Unfortunately, as a result of many environmental changes, its populations are steadily shrinking. It is quite a large plant, growing on wet meadows, the edges of peat bogs and the edges of wet forests. It willingly forms interspecific hybrids with various flower colors. There are also albino forms. The leaves are large and broad with numerous dark spots, hence another Polish name for the plant. Stoplamek szerokolistny. Here grows the last of the musk orchids in the territory of Poland. This is a species of orchid which historically was known from about 20 localities within present-day Poland, but as a result of land reclamation has disappeared from all of them. The circumstances in which it died out in the last known locality was the Wiesna Marsh in the first half of the 1960s, when the government of the People's Republic of Poland planned to make the vast marshes in the Wiesna area more productive, are significant. A group of scientists undertook research during which they demonstrated the very high natural value of the area, including the presence of the musk orchid flowers, and despite the fact that there was censorship, they managed to publish an article in which it was indicated that if this land reclamation, this upgrading was carried out, the species would probably disappear within 10 or 15 years. As it turned out, the scientists were only partly right, because after these land reclamation measures had been carried out, the musk orchid and other rare species disappeared from the site within 3 or 4 years. Today, we have fields of nettles there. Musk orchids have been known in the Rospuda Valley since 1987. The population is stable with several hundred specimens every year. The species has excellent conditions for development here as the mosslands of the Rospuda Valley have an undisturbed hydrological system. The area is perfectly watered all the time. Along with it, there are, among others, the fen orchid, the chalk fragrant orchid, the marsh helleborine, the early marsh orchid, subspecies Ochroleuca. These areas are characterized by very high natural values. It is probably the last such large river valley with preserved mosslands, that is, such alkaline, flowing peat bogs in Europe. The greatest threats to our orchids include, above all, the disappearance of the habitats that these beautiful plants prefer. Species living in peat bogs and hydrogenic habitats, that is, those dependent on a high level of flowing or groundwater, are disappearing as a result of the drying of these ecosystems and the encroachment of succession of competitively strong, expansive plant species on peat bogs. This process is certainly influenced by the current climate changes, lack of snowy winters and adequate annual precipitation, as well as high temperature, increased evaporation and transpiration of plants. We are in the northern part of the Suwałki region in the area of Szelment Lakes. We have a raised bog around us, and on its periphery there is a Hamarbaia paludosa. Hamarbaia paludosa is most often found in raised bogs and transitional bogs. It may be worth pointing out that raised bogs are bogs which are fed by rainwater. Transitional bogs are fed by rainwater and groundwater, and low bogs, such as those home to the fen orchid, are fed by groundwater. This has a reflection on the pH of the substrate, and it is on raised bogs where Hamarbaia grows, the substrate is usually acidic, rarely approaching neutral. This species is one of the smallest members of the orchid family in Poland, but it is also highly threatened with extinction. Over the last few decades, more than half of the historically known stands of the Hamarbaia paludosa have been lost in Poland, and the reason for this was most often drainage, which led to a change in hydrological conditions in the peat bog or started the process of peat decay, which in turn enables the development of strong, expansive, competitive species of perennial plants, shrubs and trees, which overshadowed this very small species. For the Hamarbaia paludosa to persist where it still occurs today, hydrological conditions must be maintained and active protection measures must be implemented in disturbed areas. This will simply mean filling in existing drainage ditches. This measure will not always be sufficient because the process of decay, or in other words mineralization of peat, may be so advanced that the availability of nutrients, nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus will be so high that strong competitive vegetation will develop anyway, despite the improvement of hydrological conditions. In such a situation, apart from not filling up the ditches, it is also necessary to implement active protection measures connected with cutting down, removing bushes, trees and sometimes even mowing the peat bogs. Meadow and grassland species decline as a result of lack of extensive grassland use, namely cattle grazing. Some forest species, on the other hand, may decline due to a change in light conditions in the forest through increased shading of the forest floor. One of the approximately 50 species of orchids we have in Poland is the autumn's lady tresses. This species blooms the latest of our native orchid species. Sometimes it can bloom even to the beginning of October. This species is inconspicuous. It is small. The whole inflorescence shoot is a maximum of 30 centimeters. The species can be said to be on the verge of extinction at the moment, and I will risk such a statement. There are a dozen or so localities in Poland. Before the Second World War, there were around 130 sites of the autumn ladies' tresses in present-day Poland, and after the Second World War, this number fell steadily as a result of changes in agriculture, mainly the abandonment of extensive grazing. It was last seen in Poland in the 1970s. It was not until 1999 that it was again found in the area of the Cieszyn foothills. Since then, about 25 localities of this species have been found, among which at least 8 should be considered extinct because they have been plowed or otherwise mechanically destroyed. Invasions of alien species, such as the small-flowered touch-me-not and the wild black cherry in various forest ecosystems, as well as intensive large-scale agriculture and industry which release mainly nitrogen compounds into the environment, result in significant fertilization of habitats and excessive growth of biomass, do not help the orchids either. Egg-leaf twayblade occurs in oak hornbeam forests and wet forests as well as in other habitats. The plant is characterized by 2 large egg-shaped leaves. Tiny yellowish-green flowers are loosely placed on the inflorescence, which often reaches 60 centimeters in height. There can be as many as 100 of them. The labellum is oblong, deeply incised, and pointing downwards. The flowers contain nectar and are pollinated mainly by Hymenoptera. However, the state forests implement many projects for the protection of orchids and their habitats. And they also carry out forest management in such a way as to be orchid-friendly in the areas where they are known to occur. For example, the lowland and mountain small retention projects result in water retention in forest and open ecosystems, which is beneficial for orchids. In Natura 2000 areas, active measures are also taken not only in forest ecosystems, but also in open ecosystems, such as various types of peat bogs, meadows, and grasslands. Orchids are not a very numerous group of plants in Poland. They constitute less than 2% of the entire vascular flora of flower plants. However, even though some species have inconspicuous inflorescences, they are hardly visible, hard to find in the field. So it is worth exploring our meadows and forests in search of our domestic orchids. And when we find such an orchid, such a specimen, let's lean over it, let's look closely at the structure of the flower, how complicated it is, and at the same time we will see its beauty, and it will turn out that in fact they do not differ from those offered to us on the market. Maybe our native orchids do not have such impressive sizes and spectacular flowers as their tropical cousins, but they are still an element of exoticism in our forests and meadows. And due to their specific development and structure, they undoubtedly constitute one of the most interesting groups of plants in Poland.